The smell appeared on a Monday morning, heavy, sweet, unmistakably rotten, the kind that instantly settled in the back of the throat and stayed there. At first, the residents blamed the trash chute, then the basement, then the ancient plumbing that rattled behind the walls at night. By noon it became clear the stench was coming through the ventilation system of one specific apartment on the 7th floor, an apartment that had officially been sealed and empty for over a year. Its owner had died alone, unnoticed for days, and no relatives ever claimed the place. The management company had locked the door, stamped it with a brittle yellow seal, and quietly removed the listing from their system. Since then, the unit had existed like a dead gap in the building, no light, no sound, no movement, only a mailbox clogged with months of unopened envelopes by Tuesday. The odor had soaked fully into the building. It crept through stairwells and elevator shafts, clung to fabric and skin, nested in curtains, mattresses, hair. People began sleeping with windows open despite the winter cold, stuffing towels under doors in a useless attempt to block it out. Maintenance crews inspected the basement, the sewer lines, the trash compactor, the roof vents. Nothing explained it. Only near that sealed 7th floor door did the smell thicken, turning dense and almost warm, as if it were still being produced. On Thursday, after dozens of complaints, permission was finally granted to break the seal. When the door opened, the stench didn't explode outward. It didn't rush or expand. It simply became clearer. Inside there was no body, just evidence of recent life that made no sense at all. A half-dried mug on the kitchen counter, grease still clinging to a pan in the sink, groceries in the refrigerator bearing current delivery dates, a damp towel hanging in the bathroom, and a bed that looked like someone had risen from it only hours earlier. Behind the couch, pressed against the wall, a wide, irregular dark stain marked the exact place where a human body had once decomposed. Later, specialists would confirm that the odor profile matched one adult human death in an advanced stage of decay, but there was nothing left to examine. No remains, no fluids, no identifiable tissue. The apartment contained a death that technically no longer existed. The only logical conclusion was that someone had removed the corpse after the decomposition had already done its work, as if the most disturbing part had been carefully taken away while everything else was deliberately left untouched. That evening, while residents stood outside watching the apartment being sealed again for the second time in a year, the smell returned. This time it was drifting up from a completely different ventilation shaft on the opposite side of the building. By the next morning, the smell had spread to 3 separate ventilation lines across the building, each one originating from apartments that were officially unoccupied. Management sealed the entire 7th floor and shut down the elevators. Residents were instructed to stay inside, but that did nothing to stop the odor from traveling through the walls themselves. The building began to feel less like housing and more like a closed system, air circling endlessly from one hidden chamber to another. People reported headaches, nausea, disorientation. Pets refused to enter certain rooms. Food spoiled faster than normal. The smell was no longer just rot. It carried an underlying dampness, thick and biological, as if the building itself were breathing. By the 3rd day, the first disappearance was noticed. A delivery worker assigned to inspect one of the newly affected apartments never checked back in. His phone last pinged inside the building before going silent. When responders entered the unit, they found the same pattern repeating itself. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, no body. Only fresh signs of habitation layered over a much older stain of decay behind the furniture. The ventilation grate inside that apartment was warm to the touch. By nightfall, the smell intensified again, this time coming from a fourth location, directly above where the missing worker had vanished. Authorities moved to evacuate. Power to the upper floors was cut. The building stood in darkness, windows glowing only from the lower levels, as residents were escorted out in controlled waves. What none of them were told was that thermal cameras inside the sealed floors were still detecting heat, signatures moving through the ventilation network slow, irregular shapes drifting where no living person could physically fit. By the time the building was fully cleared, 6 apartments showed the same progression. 6 stains. 6 spaces where bodies should have been, and not a single trace of where any of them had gone. Demolition was scheduled 2 weeks later, quietly approved under emergency health regulations. Officially, the building was declared structurally unsafe due to biocontamination. Unofficially, every inspection team sent inside reported the same impossible detail. The ventilation system no longer matched any original architectural plan. Shafts bent at wrong angles, narrowed where no machinery could operate, and widened into hollow pockets that did not appear on any blueprint. Inside those pockets, the walls were coated with layered human residue traces of multiple bodies that had been present, decayed, and removed repeatedly over time. The smell was no longer localized. It had soaked into the concrete itself. On the final night before demolition, a power crew restoring temporary electricity to the lower floors lost contact with 2 technicians. Their last recorded thermal images showed them standing near an open ventilation panel, heat signatures stable and upright until new shapes appeared behind the walls. These were longer, thinner, and moving through the shafts with deliberate control, not drifting, not collapsing, but navigating. The technicians' signatures vanished seconds later. When responders arrived, they found no bodies, no blood, no disturbance. Only fresh stains forming behind the walls, still darkening as the concrete absorbed them. The building was demolished at dawn. Official records would list 8 unexplained deaths connected to the address, all classified as structural accidents or medical emergencies. The ventilation system was buried, crushed, and sealed beneath layers of debris and asphalt. 3 months later, in a newly constructed residential complex 6 blocks away, the first complaint was filed by a tenant on the upper floor. The report described a strange, sweet odor coming from the vents faint at first, but growing warmer by the hour. The listing appeared again on a Tuesday morning, buried between dozens of ordinary suburban properties, but the address stopped her instantly. It was the same house she had already sold twice. Same narrow driveway cracked by frost. Same pale siding stained by rain runoff. Same dead oak leaning toward the roof as if it were permanently listening. The first buyers had lasted 14 months. The second made it less than 9. Both families vanished without warning, mortgage abandoned, cars left in the driveway, pets gone, personal belongings untouched. At the time, everything had been written off as coincidence layered over quiet panic. People moved. People ran. People broke. But now the house was back for a third time, listed by the bank again, staged again, disinfected again, photographed again. Fresh paint on old walls. New carpet over old floors. A clean shell placed over something that refused to leave. She drove past it that evening without intending to stop. The porch light was on. That detail unsettled her more than the missing owners ever had. The house was supposed to be empty, yet the lawn had been freshly cut. The trash bins had been rolled to the curb and brought back in. The front windows reflected the sky with a warm, inhabited stillness that no vacant property ever carried. The lockbox still hung from the doorknob where she had left it 2 years earlier, scuffed in the same places, swinging slightly in the wind. Even the front mat had been repositioned, aligned square with the threshold. The place did not look abandoned. It looked paused. When the bank finally authorized another walkthrough days later, the interior repeated the same impossible story it always did. Furniture stood in calm, careful positions, as if arranged by someone who understood comfort but did not need it. Shoes rested by the entrance in matched pairs. A child's backpack leaned against a kitchen chair, empty but heavy with use. Framed photographs on the walls all faced inward, turned toward the drywall as if something on their surfaces was not meant to be seen. Food had long since rotted and been removed, yet the deeper signs remained, softened wear paths across the carpet where daily movement had carved memory into fabric. Shallow indents in couches shaped like permanent absence. Beds that had been slept in often enough to remember the weight of shoulders. Everything suggested that entire families had stepped outside briefly and never returned, but also that someone else had stayed behind long enough to carefully erase the moment they vanished. The record should have ended her suspicion, but instead they deepened it. Every family that had lived in the house had different backgrounds, different jobs, different financial histories. No shared employer, no shared school districts, no visible connection. Yet the timelines overlapped with unsettling precision. Each disappearance occurred within a narrow window between 8 and 11 months of occupancy. There were no foreclosures triggered by missed payments in advance, no signals of premeditated escape. Bank accounts froze mid-transaction. Credit cards went silent between ordinary purchases. Cars were left with keys inside. One family had vanished on the same day they filed a request to repaint the living room. The house absorbed them at moments of routine. Not crisis. She began driving to old neighborhoods where the missing family's relatives still lived. Some had moved away. Some refused to open doors. Those who did shared the same unstable mixture of shame and disbelief. Police had investigated each disappearance separately, never as a single chain. There had been searches, interviews, ground scans for graves, financial audits for fraud. Everything collapsed into ambiguity. Adults did not simply disappear with their children, yet here it had happened repeatedly, across different years under different town administrations. Publicly, the cases were classified as unresolved missing persons. Privately, most investigators had stopped using the word missing at all. The pattern didn't suggest escape. It suggested removal. When she returned to the house again, she noticed structural details she had overlooked before. hairline cracks in the basement walls that didn't match the foundation's age. Fresh interior repairs layered over older ones in the same precise locations. Door frames that had been replaced more than once despite no recorded fire or flood damage. Every renovation circled the same central corridor where the bedrooms narrowed unnaturally, as if the architecture itself had been quietly reshaped from the inside. In the attic, she found insulation redistributed into clean, purposeful troughs, tracing paths above the ceiling beams. The house wasn't just being inhabited. It was being adjusted to accommodate something that moved where people were never meant to go. The sale went through faster than expected. A young couple, recently married, no children, no local family ties. The house was empty for only 6 days before the lights came on again. The porch light returned first, then the bedroom windows, then the faint movement of shadows behind curtains at night. She watched the property from a distance for weeks, learning its new rhythm. Trash moved to the curb every Thursday. A different car appeared in the driveway every few days. The routine rebuilt itself too quickly, like something rehearing a familiar role. 8 months later, the pattern reached its edge again. The porch light stayed on through the entire night. The trash bins were never brought back in. The car remained in the driveway with frost thickening on the windshield. No one answered the door. Authorities entered 3 days later. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no disarray beyond what had already become familiar. Shoes aligned near the door, dishes rinsed and stacked, bed covers folded back as if the couple had stood up and never returned. The walls of the central hallway were different now. Fresh structural warping had appeared in places that could not shift without internal pressure. In the attic, the insulation channels had widened. In the basement, a new fracture ran diagonally through the concrete, still shedding fine dust. What disturbed investigators most was the sound behavior inside the house. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. Weight registered on floors that remained visually empty. The house was no longer just containing absence. It was carrying mass. It was the neighboring properties that finally confirmed what the records could not. 5 months after the last disappearance, subtle changes began next door. Fixtures vibrated for no mechanical reason. A wall cracked cleanly along a straight vertical line that did not follow the building frame. Rooms closest to the old house grew colder than the rest. By the time the first neighbor vanished, the outline of the original structure could be faintly traced beneath the drywall of the adjoining home, as if an entire architectural shape was slowly imprinting itself through shared ground. The house was no longer returning alone. It was extending. The demolition order was issued quietly, without press releases or public explanations. Structural instability, ground contamination, insurance complications. The neighborhood was cleared in stages, families relocated under vague emergency clauses. The house did not resist the process. Heavy machinery arrived before dawn, and by sunset, the structure that had repeated itself across decades was reduced to fractured timber, broken drywall, and crushed concrete. The central corridor collapsed last. Even as it fell, the warped geometry of it remained briefly visible in the wreckage, its dimensions holding shape longer than the rest of the building. When the dust settled, crews reported an abnormal heat signature beneath the foundation, lingering where no utilities had ever been mapped. The site was sealed with concrete. No basement remained, no crawl space, no hollow left behind. Construction began 7 months later. A new residential development replaced the property with identical modern units, shallow foundations, standardized ventilation, and uniform load-bearing walls. For a while, nothing happened. Families moved in. Furniture arrived. Life reconstructed itself cleanly. Then the maintenance requests started. Hairline cracks formed in the same precise interior locations across multiple units. Sound traveled where it shouldn't. Cold pockets emerged in central corridors regardless of weather or insulation. Thermal scans returned inconsistent results, faint mass where no void existed. By the time the first tenant disappeared, investigators found the same internal markers repeated behind fresh drywall. Structural compression with no source. Pressure without direction, space that had been repurposed without excavation. The pattern no longer required a house. It had learned to survive redevelopment. Across 3 different cities over the next decade, identical vacancy chains quietly formed near demolition zones tied to the original property's contractor network. Ownership records overlapped just enough to be dismissed as coincidence. Missing persons reports accumulated without shared jurisdiction. What disappeared was always the same. Families, couples, entire daily lives removed at moments of routine. What remained was also always the same: intact surroundings, recent use, and the faint architectural signature of something that no longer depended on walls to carry its shape. The house had stopped returning. It had become permanent,